So the simulation's roughly in two parts, where the particles are coming up to form around this guy, and then the actual part where he starts emitting liquid as he starts dancing once he pops out of here. If we select the mesh here and hit Object, Quick Effects, Quick Liquid, that is going to immediately give us our domain. First thing, let's just scale the domain so it fits in a little bit more here. We actually do want this bottom part of the domain to line up exactly with where our floor is, because I'm not going to add the floor in as a container or as a collision object like we will with some of these other pieces, just so it doesn't leak. I don't know, I feel like it's kind of cleaner having the domain floor be the actual floor it's going up against. So once we have that here, we can go into top view and move this around a little bit. Just move these over here. Move this over here just so we get a little bit of this particles that are going to trail in. And then let's see here how, yeah, does this cover the animation beats? Okay, he exits it a little bit right here. So we'll move this out. Okay, I don't like how much space there is here that we're not really using. So because we have this bigger movement over here, let's actually move all of these over here, and we'll just flip the sides of that, because that is going to allow us to make this domain smaller. Essentially, what this domain is, if you're new to liquid simulations, is like, oh, well, where the liquid is going to be calculated, of course, but the benefit of having it smaller is it just will calculate a lot faster, and because it calculates a lot faster, it's actually going to allow us to do a more detailed simulation within it. So the smaller we can make this right now, theoretically the better simulations we'll have. Although, as we'll talk about later, having a more detailed simulation isn't always better, because you want to consider the size of the liquid as well. Scaling is one of the biggest issues or things to consider when you're doing liquid simulations, and scaling in terms of, do you want it to make it feel like it's, you know, a micro raindrop, or do you want it to feel like a giant ocean? And that is a little bit independent of scene size. It's not going to inherently know which one you want, because as you're going through the resolution divisions, this is essentially controlling the scale of the simulation. So there's actually a certain point in which having too much resolution is going to make your fluid simulation look unrealistic, at least to the scale that you're trying to portray. For right now though, let's just work on this more complicated simulation. We'll get to the build-up later. So theoretically right now it's at 164, it looks like, no, 165 that the animation actually starts. I should say before getting into this, I'm assuming some baseline familiarity with MantaFlow. If you want, there are some fantastic tutorials here by MK Graphics, and then also here by Crossmind Studio that I will link below, that go over some basics and more advanced stuff too, honestly, than what I cover here, that I really recommend. There's also this tutorial here by Blender Made Easy, which I use as heavy inspiration for the particles and for the shape, the material of the particles. We'll get into this more later, but if you want just a baseline knowledge, or if things that I'm saying don't make sense to you, I'd check in with these tutorials. But I'll try to kind of go over the basics as I'm doing this. So now that we have our domain set up, you can actually kind of see here, this box is what the resolution division is going to be. So this is probably one of the most important factors here. So, you know, you can see once you change it to 128, it moves to be smaller. 128 is pretty good for doing initial tests, and we'll probably make it even more detailed later on. You know, if you think about kind of the size of what this looks like, you know, what a particle you might want it to be, or like what a droplet of water would be in comparison to this barrel, it's gonna be, you know, like even just a quarter of this actual size. So we'll bump this up to I don't know, maybe 300, 400, or 500 for a final render. But for right now, just to keep it speedy, let's keep it to 128. The next most important value is right up here, timescale. I generally find MantaFlow is a little bit fast for my liking, so I'll lower this a bit. 0.8 is good. Sometimes I go as low as 0.5. But that's something you can play around with for your own project. Just note, this is a lot of fun to animate, to create slow motion within your simulation at different points. Time steps minimum maximum is the amount of steps in between each frame that I'll use to calculate where the liquid or where the particles are going to go next. This is something that I don't touch at first for these initial bakes, but when we get into more precise renders, we will probably come back to this and up this a bit. Border collisions for this, I don't want it bouncing off any of the walls except for the bottom, so I'm going to turn off all of these except for the bottom. This liquid, I'll keep the same for right now. You can change the flip ratio. The more you lower this, the less splash you'll get. So it can be good if you want like a more of a gooey solution, but it might honestly be better at that point to use diffusion, which is essentially can give you different levels of surface tension. That'll make it look more like honey, oil, or water. These are the presets you can kind of tell. We'll keep it at water for right now. I'm not really planning on playing with this much. This will give you more detail up here too, but generally I'll just keep this at the, we'll also keep mesh off, but mesh is probably the other most important factor for when you're actually doing liquid simulations. And let's just have, going down to cache, let's start just caching this and seeing what happens. So we'll start this at 177 and then we'll have it end at 500. It's a long simulation, and then we'll change the type from replay, which is going to play within the viewport every time you hit spacebar. It's going to recalculate it, to all for right now, and then also click is resumable. That's going to allow us to pause and then continue baking the simulation again if we want to pause and check where it's at in the middle of it. Modular we'll actually do a little bit more later. That just is useful, especially if you're doing a mesh simulation where you can simulate just the particles and then later on simulate the mesh once you're happy with the particles. This all looks good right now. I don't know, we'll see how quickly this goes. So let's exit this, go back and see. All right, so you can see up here, we, as cool as that looks, we need to change some things. Now we can go into the mesh and go into the physics settings and mess with some of these settings here. So flow behavior, geometry means that it just generates from the first frame of the geometry and then lays out. We actually want it to be in flow, and once we do that, we can go and click on our mesh again, free the simulation, bake it again. It'll automatically create a cache folder right by your project file. Sometimes you'll want to create your own cache, and then it'll also automatically load over or erase and then replace the cache every time you do a cache. So if you want to like save different caches, you might want to just click this folder option and save it throughout the process to different folders. All right, let's just see where that's going now. Ooh, sweet. All right. Nice. All right, so it's looking pretty good. I mean, that's like a lot of, as you can tell, like I don't know, this is just so cool. There are a couple things though to fix immediately that I can see. One of them is this kind of lack of interpolation between arm movements here. And then the other problem is right now the liquid is just falling down wherever it spawns, and it doesn't take on any of the velocity from the head or arm movements here. So we can do both of those if we click on our main geometry, and for the velocity problem, we can just click on initial velocity, and then it'll start off with a value of 1. So we'll keep that for now. And then for the interpolation, kind of increasing how much it goes here, that's just a sampling substeps, specifically on your geometry. There's other ways to increase these substeps in other parts of the simulation, but the only one that's going to solve this issue is if you're actually on the object. So let's just increase that to 1 and see where that takes us. This can pretty quickly make your simulation a lot more beefy, which isn't always good. So we'll start small for right now. Let's see what happens here. So if we exit here, woo, all right. That is not exactly what we want. So that is all because of the initial velocity. We'll want to reduce this source multiplier. So let's say to 0.5. Actually, I think 0.3, even low as 0.3 is what I did for the other one. And then let's increase the sampling substeps to 2 and rebake this. Uncheck this. Oh, wow. Okay, so you can already see this. Even just having 0.3 for this initial wave here is doing a lot. It might just be something inherent with that, because that's going to mean that, I mean, it could be really cool to have a lot. I don't know. This is a part where it's getting into the artistic interpretation. Like let's try lowering this all the way to like 0.1 and see what vibe we get. It might be something where we keyframe this value, so for the initial movement it's a lower value, and then for the rest of it we will slowly keyframe up that source velocity, just because that first movement I know is going to be the biggest one. All right, so let's exit this. Ooh, okay, so you can see it's a lot more contained now. Yeah, it's like barely picking that up. Does work, but I want a little more than that. In terms of the substeps though, that's good. If we want it to be a completely flat wall, we might want to increase this to, what is it, 3 for final substeps, just so there's not that much separation there. But you can see it's pretty, oh, that's actually pretty spaced out. Yeah, let's do 3, even for these early tests. And then let's increase this to 0.2, maybe 0.25, screw it. Let's do another one. Yeah, so a lot of this process is just kind of playing with these values at first. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, increasing the time steps maximum might help a bit with how fast the particles were moving off of the geometry. One of the beautiful and annoying things about liquid simulations is how much everything is interconnected. And it's all invisible until you notice it and play around with it yourself. So let's see what happens. But if we increase these time steps maximum, let's say to 24, it's gonna increase the time it takes to sim, no doubt, but hopefully it should make it more accurate. Okay, yeah, so it still is huge in this initial part here. So let's just free this. Let's lower this down to 0.2, and let's keep that there. And let's just find like a base level that we're happy with. Be somewhere in between 0.1 and 0.3 is definitely the vibe for this. I like thinking about it as if you're kind of going from the outside in, so you're kind of going from the most general, like big variables into it. So that usually ends up meaning you're playing with the resolution divisions, time scale, kind of having that set off at the start, even though you probably will go in and for a high resolution bake include these resolution divisions at the end. But at least starting off with that and then going in and increasing the velocities and then the substeps, and then finally these time steps are even a little bit more nitty-gritty details. And then from there, you might want to go into these liquid properties and mess with this stuff here. So let's see what this looks like. Okay, so this is nice. So that's pretty cool. Let's see what more of let's just let it bake for the whole thing and see how much the velocity, if the velocity fits for it. So if we hit escape, that's gonna pause it, and oh, that's so cool. Yeah, so you can see some of the liquid it's escaping the edges here. Once we animate the camera, we can see how much of that is going to be in frame, and then expand the domain from there. It's really like a back and forth process for a lot of this. It's just because all these little things are going to affect other things, and yeah, we'll have to see where the camera is, because my main worry with this initial splash is that it's splashing, and then if we're anywhere past, this line here, with the camera, then if we're on this side of it, we're going to notice those particles just suddenly disappearing. But if it looks natural to have the camera in there, I think that might work. And for this one, I don't really care about the particles kind of escaping off to the sides here. Depending on your situation, you might want it to kind of slowly fill up a surface. If you are finding that your viewport is getting a bit laggy here, we're going at 20 frames per second when we oh, that was another thing I completely forgot, but we should actually have gone in and set this to be 30 frames a second, because that's what the initial animation was at. To be honest, because we already timed up the music at 25 frames a second and all of this, let's just keep it here. Oh man. Yeah, all right, learn from my mistakes. So let's go in, resume. So somewhere in here we want the simulation to end, but we don't want to just fade out what we actually want is for this guy to stop emitting fluid. So if we can select him, so right in here is the final note. The visuals are a bit lagging behind the audio for Blender, but this actually it's this note right here that I want to end it on. Oh yeah, that's a great frame. Okay, so once with our guy selected, we can just go in here and click and keyframe this by clicking that dot, go over one frame, uncheck use flow, click this again, and that'll mean that the next time we simulate it, it'll actually stop emitting liquid right here. And then in the end, we're actually going to want it to do that and then probably give it a little bit more time to fade out. So just as some buffer room, let's expand our simulation to 530. Oops. 530 here. And then we won't rebake it all right now, but I'm just going to go in here before I forget. Expand this to 530. All right. We have that set up. Now let's just set up the collision of these objects here. All right, so let's select an object we want it to collide with. Go to Fluid, Type, Effector, Collision. And we'll keep it sampling subsets 1 for right now. We might up that later on, but for right now, let's just keep that. And then if we shift select the other objects we want it to collide with, we definitely know these are, there's a chance we want it to collide with this one. And there's a even slimmer chance that we'll even see it colliding over here. But let's just get those to be safe. And then shift select this one again to make it the active object. If we go to object, link transfer data, and then copy modifiers, you'll see that it copies the collision effector modifier onto all of these objects. If we want to do a quick, just, resim the start of the simulation to double check. All right, let's see. Bam. Yeah, okay, ooh. Is it going through that right now? It does look like it's going through that. All right, so I think a large part of this issue is that a lot of these parts are just really thin. It's not one layer, but it's so thin. It's because our domain itself, it's only calculating at this thickness. And right now our table, it's just it's almost the exact same thickness. So a high resolution sim should deal with this issue. So we are going to be doing some high resolution simulations later. So let's just leave the table here for now and hope that fixes it. Otherwise, I mean, like, this is all looking great. Like, look at that. Look at that. I love this so much. Okay. I'm pretty happy with the direction that this is all going in. I know we're gonna have to make the domain a little bit bigger at some point. For right now, let's just go in and do the start of the simulation here. So what we'll actually want to do is, now that we're going to be expanding the frame start of the simulation to frame 1, before we forget, let's select the mesh and keyframe the use flow again. So it used to be right here. So let's keyframe that, go to a frame before, click that off, and keyframe it again. So that way, even when we move this back to 1, it's not gonna really start. So to get that flowing together effect, essentially all it is adding another source of liquid out here on the ground, and then adding a force field to our object here, which is why it's important that we actually want him to be completely still up until this point, which is why we deleted the keyframes earlier for his dancing before the liquid simulation. So if we select him, we could go into force field. We'll select force, and we'll go to shape, and we'll make it surface. Very important to not have every point. Every point is going to make your simulation take forever and likely crash your computer. So I have surface here, and that's essentially going to emit a force from each face of the surface. And right now it's emitting a force with a strength of 1. And so it's going to be pushing things away. So we already know that because we want it drawing in, we're just going to turn that to a strength of -1. But we don't have a source for the water here. Make sure we're in simulation here. And let's just we'll add a cube. We know we want the particles kind of starting out here and trailing in over here. We know we need some of these liquids to be more on this side. So let's scale it up. Make it a little bit skinnier so they're kind of all on the floor. You can already kind of tell though, but because we want this, or at least because I want this, this trailing effect here, that we're gonna need to take our domain, grab that, expand it here, expand it a little bit here to just give us a little bit of leeway coming in. Our domain, let's just apply the scale, just to make sure we didn't mess up anything. It's just Command A to apply scale. And just double checking that the actual, this voxel is smaller than the width of this particle spawner here. To your object, go to fluid, type, flow, liquid, go to flow behavior and make it inflow. Or let's actually make a geometry. We'll see. If we want more particles, we'll make it inflow, but that'd only be for a couple seconds. So we'll do that, and then, yeah, let's just see how that looks. Alright, let's just stop, make sure we're generating particles, and we are not generating particles. Do we need a flow collection? Should we put both this and the original mesh here? We can move this into a new collection called flow. Put it back in simulation. Oh, we don't want liquid domain in here. We want liquid domain out of here. I'm going to put that in flow as well. So that way we can just select specifically this flow collection. Interesting. Alright, actually, after a bit of playing around, I found out that it was the surface emission value. If you increase that to something like 1, is going to let the particle spawn. Which is weird because for this mesh, we don't have any surface emission value. Yeah, it does spawn, but hey, this works. I'm not going to question it. And now that we have this set up with -1 here, we'll change some of these values a little bit later, but right now, let's just bake and see how it looks. Make sure it is actually, there we go. Sweet, okay, sweet. And you can start to see the waters moving towards him. And I can already tell that this is going to be a little bit too much water. I mean, just looking at the volume of this cube and how much water we want actually around him. We might even just be able to scale this so it's only on this side of the barrels here. So you can see it's going pretty quickly over to him. If you want the simulation to play back a little bit faster, you can always go into the particle settings of the liquid, go into Viewport, display, and decrease the amount of particles that you're actually seeing. So right now it's at 100%, but we could lower this, and then you'll see it plays a lot quicker. You can see it's a little bit janky, but it technically will play fast. And you know what? Let's just kind of move you over here. Let's move that there. But let's remember to turn this back from inflow back to just geometry, so we'll only get 1 frame of particles inflowing into the simulation. And again, the general concept here is we just want the particles to come up, conglomerate around him, and then at a certain point we're going to turn off this force on him, and at the same time have the second simulation start of the inflow liquid. Alright, sweet. So yeah, you can see it's going pretty quick. Almost a little too quick. One thing we'll want to do to switch this is actually this flow effect here. I'll be honest, I don't know the full technical details into this flow effect, but for any force, the strength and the flow are the 2 biggest factors. If I'm understanding correctly, having a flow of 1 is going to make it go slower, and it's also going to make it more realistic. Let's just see what it looks like with a flow value of 1 to see if that slows it down a little bit. So yeah, you can see it's actually getting caught a little bit there. And also, I really don't like how jank that looks, so let's just increase this to full. And let's just continue the bake. That might be a good speed. We'll see. Alright, so now I'm just thinking, if we have the camera angle kind of set up here, then the liquid comes in here, we're going to trail with it as it goes. This is a nice speed for that trailing at least, but we want to make sure it hits its mark on, where is it, by right here. We should, I like this audio cue going in for it like really starting to build up and get excited. And then definitely by this point here, by this gap, we need it to be completely covered. So that's, let's see, 179. So let's resume until we get to 179. So it is too slow. So we could lower the flow to 0.5. Let's see what that does. And then we might want to keyframe this strength value up as it goes towards there. So let's just see what happens with 0.5 flow on our object here. Let's free, bake you again. Come back to this. Alright, see, it's still moving too slow. It's also just not feeling strong enough. So let's increase the strength to -2, and let's actually keyframe it. So it kind of goes to here a little bit slower. Keyframe this, and then by the time it gets up to like right in here, should be at -5. We'll just up this a little bit here. And then we want it to pretty much dramatically stop all of a sudden as this other simulation kicks in. So just a couple frames after this one kicks in, we'll have it stop. So maybe something like right here, because what you actually want, if we were to stop it exactly when, so we'll keyframe this here, we'll go 1 frame forward, we'll keyframe it to 0, let's say. Because if you actually had this, it stopping right when this, right when the second simulation started, then you'll find that the rest of the water just suddenly kind of like droops down. But because we get catch a little bit of the starting animation movement here, it'll kind of like blend into it a little more. So let's see what that looks like. Yeah. Alrighty, and this one looks a lot better. Oh, it's just that little bit of swirling around because the arms are separated is so sick. Okay, yeah, I think that might be the right timing. That looks so great. One helpful thing that I like to do is actually, once you're getting to this part of the simulation, is just to hide the mesh, and also hide the skeleton to really start to see how much of it is, how much of the form is actually visible versus just us seeing the mesh. I don't like how slowly these particles are coming down here. Let's let the simulation run a little longer, and then we'll do a viewport render of the whole thing to see how the timing actually feels, and then I'll also get it accurately synced up with the music here. Actually, I think I already know why this is feeling especially slow. While there's no strength on this, there's still flow here, so it's still giving some drag force to that part of the liquid, and maybe the rest of the liquid too. Yeah, it does look like the rest of the liquids especially. Okay, so what we'll do here, right when we've keyframed this value here, you know, let's see, just so for clarity's sake, we'll also keyframe flow to 0, hit I, add new keyframe. Alright, so let's rebake this entire thing now, get the full thing, and yeah, do a full viewport render and see how it looks. Alright. Yeah, that's a fun pose. We might want to extend the render time just a little bit for this to die down some, but I think that's about as good as we're gonna get. Now, let's really quickly set up a viewport render. So I'm gonna deselect that. This is probably a good view to have. What I'm gonna end up doing is going to viewport render animation, which is gonna take the viewport and render out the animation from the viewport, which will be a lot faster to render, which is great, but we also need to make sure that it's set up efficiently. So we'll switch this to a video codec, switch it to MPEG 4, And then also make sure to include audio. This is really, really important here. AAC is pretty good, so that'll include the audio naturally with this. We might do some tweaks on this audio later in Davinci to make it seem to blend the seams a little bit better, but this is good for now. And then let's just also set it to cache the result just in case it crashes partway through. We'll just call this Viewport Sim, or what do we want to call this? Warehouse Stance Viewport Sim 1.0. Just to see. And then I always like to give a little space after that name there just to, because it will automatically put the frame start and end values. Let's clean up the viewport by deselecting these two. I don't know, not that big of a deal, but it's nice to have that. And then render this out. Oh, I'm realizing as this is rendering, there's actually an opportunity to have like the source of these particles be from a spilled barrel. So it's kind of like maybe some chemical waste almost. That could be interesting. Oh, that looks... I'm really happy with that transition moment. Alright. Alright, so I guess the question is, do we want to change this up and have the water be coming from a barrel here? Oh, but I already like how well timed this is. I don't know if I want to mess with too much back and forth to figuring out the strength values of this again. Let's set up the cameras and just see how this feels as a camera movement, and then we'll do a viewport render of the camera and then figure it out from there.